Hey everyone, this is Coach Castoni from thechesswebsite.com, and in this video, I'll show you how every chess piece moves, what it's called, and how much it's worth. Chess can seem complex, but once you know how the pieces move, you're most of the way to playing the game. Each player starts with 16 pieces, and the goal is simple. You want to checkmate your opponent's king, which means you try to put that king in a position where it cannot escape the capture. And every game begins with the same setup. What's worth remembering is that the queen is starting on the color that you're playing. So if you're playing with the white pieces, it's going to start on the D1 square on the light color. And if you're starting playing with the black pieces, then the queen is going to be on the dark color square. Now I'd like to introduce you to all of the pieces one by one and teach you how they move. First of all, the pawns. Usually start with 8 of them on the second row from white's point of view. And this is a very unique piece because it's the only piece that moves differently compared to how it will be able to capture opponent's pieces. Most of the time, you're going to be using pawns one move forward with one exception, that when you're starting the game, your pawn, the first time it moves, can actually choose to move 2 squares up or 1 square up. If you're using the pawn to be pushed only 1 square forward, later you're losing the opportunity to push it by 2. And vice versa. If you decide to push pawn by 2, it will only be able to move 1 square forward at a time. Now it captures 1 square diagonally. So that means if opponent goes with the pawn move e7 to e5 over here, your pawn can actually take this pawn, and that means you're going to have a situation where pawn up. On the other hand, if opponent will play a move d5, this is what we call a blockade. And because pawns don't capture, they only move 1 square forward, white's pawn is unable to capture this guy over here. Unless, of course, black is going to push one of these pawns forward towards us, and then white's pawn will be able to take them. Another interesting thing about the pawn is that when it reaches the end of the board, it can promote to any piece but the king. And most of the time we're using it to promote into a queen, because queen is the most powerful piece, as you will know in a couple of minutes. So that means that in especially the ending stage of the game, we're trying to reach the top of the board with our pawns to get ourselves a new queen. The next piece that I would like to introduce you to are rooks. Usually start them in the corners on respective from white point of view a1 and h1 squares. They move like a plus. So you can not only move it up by 1 square, but you could actually go all the way to the top until you meet one of the opponent's pieces or pawns. So what's interesting is that you cannot jump over opponent's pieces with any other piece but the knight, as you're going to learn in a couple of minutes. So that means that this rook over here could go to one of these squares or one of these squares, but the rook is unable to jump to the a8 square, highlighted right now in red. That also means that this rook is unable to go to one of these squares because the white's king is in the way. Of course, our rook could also capture the pawn on a7, highlighted in green. The next piece that I would like to introduce you to is the knight. It's perhaps the most tricky of all, but let me make it simple for you. They move in the shape of an L. Knight will move 2 squares in one direction, usually up, down, or sideways, and then 1 square to the side. So for example, 2 up, 1 to the right, or 2 up, 1 to the left, or 2 to the bottom, 1 to the right, or 2 to the side, 1 to the bottom or the top. So essentially from this position, the knight could reach these 8 squares. For example, 2, 1, or 2, 1, or 2, 1, or 2, 1. At first, knights are perhaps the most tricky pieces of all. However, later, your brain will just adapt to see those squares, and it's going to become second nature. What is interesting about the knight that it's the only piece in chess that can jump over opponent's pieces. So even though this pawn is on the square, we can actually jump over, and it's still legal according to the rules to move the knight to this square. Same would be if we wanted to reach this square. Our knight can simply jump over 2 and 1 and reach this square by jumping over opponent's pawn. The next pieces are bishops. They move diagonally. So if rook moves like a plus to the sides, top and bottom, the bishops move diagonally like this. However, it's different from a pawn. Pawn was able to capture only one square diagonally. The bishops can actually move across the whole diagonal. So if we're picking this bishop, which would be called the light square bishop, remember that you're always starting the game with one light color bishop and one dark color bishop. And because as you move diagonally across the chessboard, it will never change its color. So my bishop from here can right now reach to any square along these diagonals. Similarly, this bishop over here could reach any of the squares on these diagonals. Remember that bishops cannot jump over other pieces or pawns. Next is the queen. If you know how the rooks move and the bishops move, well, queen just moves like the combination of the two. So that means that it can move like a plus or like a rook, and also it can move like a bishop. It is the most powerful piece on a chessboard. So our queen from this square could reach any of the squares on these green arrows. Next is the king. King can move one square to all the squares around it. So we could reach any of the squares on these green bubbles. Of course, we're never allowing our king to be captured. So if one of opponent's pieces is, for example, controlling or looking at this square, our king would not be able to go there because that would mean that our opponent's piece can capture it. So that would be illegal. However, if all of these squares are available and none of the opponent's pieces are looking at those squares, our king can go to any of the squares around it. Last but not least, let's talk about the value of the pieces. We usually estimate pawn worth as 1 point. However, remember that if it reaches the end of the board, you could convert or transform it to a queen, which is the most valuable piece on the board. Rooks are worth 5 points, so they're second most valuable pieces after the queen. The bishops or knights are worth 3 points each. The queen, most powerful piece on the board, it's worth 9 points. And we're not giving any value in the point system to the king, even though it is not the most powerful piece, it's the most valuable piece that you have. Please visit the chesswebsite.com for more similar lessons. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I'm looking forward to seeing your first games, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.